Hi, it's Dr. Barik, and we're on Module 3, Womanhood. My light is fading, my quality is not as great as I'd like it to be, and I am trying to push forward and get one more lecture done tonight. So the major themes, this is really about adulthood, womanhood, and so I'm focusing on family relationships and mothers, career issues, positive aging, so just sort of how do we see adulthood and especially older adulthood in a positive light, and I want to touch briefly on friendships. This first chapter talks about mothering, and they bring up the issue of mothers and fathers being mocked in the media. I think it's an interesting question. I've heard a lot of critiques of men being portrayed as incompetent parents on media, but that was probably more 5 to 10 years ago that I would have heard that critique in general. I think there's more and more portrayals of men as involved fathers, even of very, very young children. But I think that this chapter does point out, I was surprised. I had not realized how little mothers were typically respected, particularly older mothers. I think mothers with young children are often portrayed pretty well, but then their mothers are portrayed as out of touch, fussy, bossy, overbearing, whatever. And I think it's yet another example of how the patriarchy hurts everyone. It's not just women who are hurt, but I think men are very limited. If you talk with any fathers of young children, you'll hear that it's really hard for them to find diaper change stations. Usually bigger places like Target can be pretty relied on to have them. Restrooms or restaurants that have gender neutral bathrooms, if they have diaper change, it's going to be accessible for everyone. But a surprising number of places do not have diaper change stations in the men's rooms. And it can be difficult to know what to do. Do you go into the women's room? Do you change them on the floor? Do you ask a stranger to change your baby? That doesn't seem like a great plan either. There's also discussion of, and I think as we have stereotypes that men are not caregivers for the very young children, that they're not changing diapers, that they're not going out by themselves, we will not have the outcry we need to have facilities for men to be out and about in public with small children. Also, we need better diaper change stations. Like, it's still not universal for women either, but you have a much better shot as a woman than as a man. Public ownership of women's reproduction, that gets discussed, that many people have opinions and express them forcefully. And they discuss here when to have a child. I have one child, he's 2. I've gotten many people, including like the person at the coffee place I go a lot, like that sort of person, who are like, oh, well, it's time to have another one. At a minimum, when are you planning to have another? Not if, but when. And I'm not planning to have another in any near span of time. And people respond very like shocked at that. That's not just like, oh, that's interesting. There's often a big pushback. I also have some friends who have 5 children or 7 children, and they talk a lot about the pushback they get about having too many children. So there's a lot of public critique for, kind of one narrow path for what's accepted, which is 2, maybe 3 children. I wanted to point out something that just struck me as odd, possible bias. It'll be interesting to see if the term stepmother also will be used to refer to lesbian mothers. That felt like just kind of a throwaway comment for something that's a bigger deal. And I'm not exactly sure what the author meant here. The author may have meant like, well, it's weird. You have 2 moms, one of whom is biologically your mom and one of whom isn't, unless you adopted a child. But often it's a biological mother and a non-biological mother, and will stepmom be used there? Or I'm not sure if she means like the complications of when a lesbian woman remarries or repartners, and now she may have either been a single parent or may have parented with a former partner. And I'm just not sure why stepmom wouldn't be the term. So it just seemed odd to me and stuck out that whatever was behind that, it didn't seem quite right. I couldn't find an explanation that fit with my views of sort of respect and equity, that made this phrase make sense. If you see what I'm missing, feel free to point it out. And I think it is, I think that there are things that can be a little more complicated when you have two same gendered parents, and especially in any situation where you're repartnering, there's a lot of question of what people will call each other and different things. There's also in my family, I have, someone who my dad has been partnered with for many years who is not his wife. And so I reached a point where I went from girlfriend to partner, and then I eventually just started saying my stepmom, because even though they're not married, that's the role she pretty much functions as within our family. So I think that it may have been meant to acknowledge that things get complicated, but it missed the mark for me. There's also a lot of issues with trying to figure out a timing to childbear when you are on the job market. And there's lots of laws about pregnancy. You're not allowed to ask if someone's pregnant or has children or wants to have children. But particularly if you are like showing levels of pregnant, there's a point of pregnancy that's really, really difficult to hide. And I think particularly for people who go long educational paths, I mean, a lot of my friends have gotten masters or PhDs. You are in your mid to late 20s or early 30s before you actually get onto, out into the career market. And so that means either you're having a child in grad school when you're broke and really busy and get a lot of judgment for that, or you wait until you're in your 30s, you get your first job, which is still really stressful. You're still in the first year of your kind of working career, because grad school is professional, but it's a different kind of professional. So you're just starting your professional career, and you may feel like you're behind on marriage, kids, house, all of those things. And so it's not great to have a kid in grad school. It's not great to have a kid in your first year or two in a new job. But if you wait too long, I mean, for one, how long should people have to wait to fit the path? But also there's increased health risks. And for me, I just acknowledge I had a kid in my 30s. If I had had him in my 20s, that's 10 more years of his life he would get to have me for. And 10 more years I would have gotten to have him. So I think there's a lot of issues with the job market. She also brings up the fatherhood bonus. So when you look on average at pay, men who have children get paid a little bit more than men who don't. And I've heard this discussed with issues of trying to have a more equitable approach to maternity and paternity leave. And I've heard people say that in academia, so there's a lot of work that we do that's outside of classes. It's research, it's writing, it's getting grants. And there is a stereotype that some men who go on paternity leave, supposedly for having a child, use a lot of that time not for house care and childcare, but for their career. And so it's like free time off from classes and time when technically nobody should expect you to do anything and you get to do things. And so what's seen as being more equitable may actually create a wider gap. I also want to be really cautious, because I think it is very important that men are, again, part of, if we want men to be equal partners in raising children, we need to treat them as equal partners from the beginning. And particularly once the baby is out in the world, for families who breastfeed, that's something that only mom can do. But other than that, mom and dad can do a lot of the same things. Also, when we think about how hard the American system is on women as far as recovering from childbirth and then jumping right back into everything, if we can have men taking some time off work to be home and help with all the care, that gives women more time to rest up after childcare. There's also issues of people who adopt. And often if you adopt, you have, if there's a maternity or paternity leave policy, you might be covered under adoption. But if, let's say, you are a foster parent and you have a new child enter your home, you typically aren't entitled to any time off for that child, regardless of the child's age. And so it's interesting to think how much better bonding might go between foster parents and foster children if there was that acknowledgement and that time off. And at the end, they talk about feminist mothering, and they really talk about that as taking on an advocacy role. And that idea of not just working toward the interests of me and people like me, but for all women and essentially all people as well. And so it's advocacy. It's also modeling for the next generation. And I know of a few different women who have ended their marriages when their children were a few years old, and many of them, a big motivation for them was, I did not want my child to grow up believing that this is what a relationship is like, and that this is how women are treated in relationships, or how men act in relationships. Uh, and they describe this common feminist saying that the personal is political, and they describe it in the way that I understand it is, if home is personal and women only are supposed to exist in the home sphere, then women have no place in the political, which means women have no rights. And mothering has no role in political. So when we say that's not political, that's personal, we're really saying, because we've created this system where women's issues are viewed as personal, we're saying women's issues can't be advocated for. And so that's a phrase that I had heard a lot, but I don't think I had ever heard explained quite the way that Hall explained it. This is, I think this is all my thoughts. It could be, I may have taken this from Hall's work. I genuinely don't remember anymore. This is why it's really important to cite and be clear as you're making notes. But I just wanted to talk about, how do we make room for women with families in career spaces? So part of it is having leave policies, including caregiving leave for both children and adults. Women, obviously, when we give birth, that is a physical experience that we need time to recover from, but also newborns are ridiculously needy. And so they just need so much care, and somebody has to provide that care. And there's also a lot of discussion of bonding between caregivers and children, which is also why I think it's really important for dads to be involved from the beginning. But also, women do a disparate, so sort of unfair or unequal, I should say, proportion of caregiving for adults as well. So older adults, the most likely person to caregive for them is their daughter. The next most likely person to caregive is their daughter-in-law, then their son, and then their son-in-law. Actually, there may be other people before that as well. And so women often have caregiving responsibilities for other adults. Flexible working time really creates a lot better environments for parents, especially to arrange childcare and things like that. So being able to work from home some, or to have flexible hours, to be able to adjust based on their schedule and what childcare they can coordinate. So for example, one parent might work an earlier shift to go in really early in the morning and then be done by the time kids get out of school. Another parent might get the kids ready in the morning, go in to work a little later, and then stay a little later. That's assuming school-age kids. Young kids need constant care. Better compensation for part-time work. I personally, my goal is for people to have the balance they want of work and family time. I went back to work full-time when my son was almost 6 months old, but keep in mind my son was 2 months early, so 2 of those months were spent going to the hospital every day. And just being completely sunk. And when I came out 2 months later with my child, he was not a 2-month-old, he was a newborn. It took us 2 months of being in the hospital to get him to the developmental point of a newborn who is super duper needy. So I was really going back to work with kind of a 3.5-month-old at home. And I was very, very happy to be back at work. I personally need that work time. I need that other part of my identity, and I need that social time. Otherwise I kind of hold up in my house, and I just really enjoy working. At the same time, it was a lot to be back full-time all at once. I would have really liked to be able to go back half-time or even 3/4 time for a year or two. But in my field, in academia, particularly once you have that full-time tenure track position, it's really hard to ease back. And if you do ease back, typically your pay drops. So let's say were to come back half-time, I would get like a quarter of my old pay. I would have a few less responsibilities overall, but it's a dramatic drop in pay for a partial drop in work. And it's much more difficult to be able to then pick back up. I know I have a family member who wanted to stay home with the daughters when they were young. Uh, she has a college degree, she's intelligent, she's charming, she's very competent, and yet she can't find a way to work. She can't figure out how to get back into paid work. And it's a trap that a lot of people fall into, particularly if you don't want to just go do kind of minimum wage sort of work. It can be very difficult due to ageism, due to having this gap in your resume, due to a lot of stigma. So better compensation for part-time work and more flexibility for slowing down and speeding up. So having different levels of caregiving responsibilities and working responsibilities at different stages in your life. Having affordable, high-quality childcare. My husband asked me a week or two ago, like, we're doing our finances. I really want to start putting money in our son's college fund again. I said, we're a little strapped right now, but we can certainly try. And I was thinking about it a little bit later and started doing the math. He goes to daycare at a university-affiliated daycare, and we get a discount because my husband works at that university. And still, we are paying more in tuition for him to go to school 5 days a week during the school year and 4 days a week in the summer for 3 months. We are paying more in daycare tuition than that college charges for like tuition. And so people, college is expensive and stressful. People worry a lot about how to pay for college. And actually, high quality childcare can cost more than college. It's certainly, and I think even cheap childcare probably costs more than community college or county college. So especially for families in poverty where the option is to go out and work a job that pays minimum wage, it's really, really hard to find to justify going out, especially if you have more than one child. The numbers do not add up. And there are some government subsidies for people who are very low income so that they can get that continuous work experience. But it's really difficult for women to be in the workforce with the cost of childcare, to have two earners in a household, and at the same time, it's really difficult to function with just one earner in a household. It's doable, but there's a lot of sacrifices that have to come along with it, and it's not very doable at minimum wage, regardless of how much you're willing to sacrifice. Again, there may be subsidies to help, but it's difficult. Another issue with women in the workforce is unpaid emotional labor. And this kind of fits, we'll talk about captaining the household, but there's things like mentoring. So if let's take, again, I'm used to kind of faculty settings. Let's say there's only one woman working in a department. Many of the female students may feel most comfortable coming to talk with that woman. Let's say another faculty member, so let's say this woman has been there 5-10 years or more, and someone new comes in. New hires who are women may also go to that woman and ask for mentoring. So when we only have a few women in positions of upper, especially when we only have a few women in senior level positions, there's a large mentoring burden that may fall to them. Also, women often people may go to women in the office for support more often than they go to men. And so even if there's kind of equal representation of men and women may get more of the burden because we're viewed as being more supportive. We also may be asked to do more things like party planning or, just prepping, planning, cleaning. It sounds silly, but even things like, who do you ask to go get the coffee? It tends to be women more often. And also there's much more of a burden to be perceived as nice. And so there's a lot more sort of managing expectations and trying to put your ideas out there without being seen as too forceful. And that just adds up to a lot that women deal with. It's also, I'm very big, as I mentioned before, on respecting individual choices and advocating for everyone's choices. I don't think there's a right answer to staying home and raising children or working full-time or something in between. I think it's very personal, just like everything is very personal, just like there's no one career path that's right for everyone. And what's right for you with one child might not be right with the next child, too. And again, I'm always very aware that there's this history of American feminism is only looking out for the rights of people who, at least in adulthood, I really fit with. I'm a white woman and I grew up very working class, but now, I'm very much upper middle class. Not wealthy, but very much upper middle or upper middle class. And I also think it's really important to, whatever we do for women, we be inclusive of men and we respect their role with families. Positive aging for women, often women are viewed as, there's a lot of stereotypes that, women over a certain age, and that age may change with time, but there's still sort of this sense that we have an expiration date. There's a lot of stereotypes of older women as being, so some of the myths that get talked about are that menopause is a big deal, that we are asexual after a certain age, that we have a big identity crisis when kids leave the house, and that we are poor, physically weak, and mentally weak. But actually, older adulthood is often seen as a time for freedom and creative outlets. It also is a time when friendships and other relationships can, and if you follow kind of a more traditional life path and you have kids, once those kids are out of the house, you really have a lot more time and energy freed up for yourself, for your own interests, and for other people to be important. Not that kids who leave the house are just suddenly done, and not that kids always leave the house the minute they turn a certain age, but there is more freedom typically. There's Women report more positive emotions as they age. It's possible that the sadder ones are dying off, but it's also possible, which, could have relationships with health effects. It also could be if you have a lot of health issues, it's a little harder to be happy. Anytime we think about positive psychology, there's a lot of potential paths that things can take. But older adult women report more emotional stability, more agreeableness, more openness. I think the social clock has kind of been pushed back 10 years. 30 is the new 20, 40 is the new 30, whatever. And also thinking about planning for older adulthood, especially retirement, and making sure that women are protected, that we know how to plan, and that we earn wages where we're able to plan. One thing that was really big here is the idea that these beliefs are culturally bound. When we think about culture, it's often kind of like our glasses, like my glasses right here. I don't notice them most of the time. Right now I can see my frames because I'm thinking about it, but most of the time they're just there. Even though they're constantly in my face, I don't notice them. And culture is the same way. It's this constant frame around how we view everything, but we forget that the frame is even there. So we think of this as just the way it is, but there are other cultures where women are much more respected in general, and there's also cultures where particularly older women and older adults in general may be more respected. So this isn't the way it has to be. This isn't an essential piece of aging. Whew. Okay, so invisible household labor. This is a very hot topic in the mom circles I travel in. And there, as we measure childcare and household, things are not equal, but they're getting much more equal. But that sense of equity may hide a lot of tasks that are involved, especially as our lives get more complicated, and especially as children's lives tend to get more sort of intensively parented. There's often a situation where the man in the house, so this is very heteronormative, I'm assuming a male and female in a relationship together, so I'll acknowledge that from the beginning. So there is often a situation where the man will want to help and will say, I'll gladly help you, just tell me what to do. But if you, one of the ways I've heard this described is in the middle of prepping a dinner party. And so there's things on the stove, there's cleaning that needs to be done, there's kids that need to be tackled and done whatever with. And even to say, I'll help, just tell me what to do, that assumes that the woman is managing everything. And it's very difficult to both manage and do. It's such a part of how households run that it's difficult to track and measure it. It's also very difficult because somebody kind of has to be in charge. It's really difficult to equally share a task or ongoing management of a task. And so this is this is one I'm very much in the thick of personally as well. And it's one that I don't see a really clear solution for, because even if we say, okay, I'll handle the medical appointments, you handle the sports, you still need to have, you need to organize in a way where the calendars are known in order to schedule anything. So I think it genuinely is difficult to figure out how to navigate this. I think there are solutions, but I think it's not a super easy solution. So when we think about invisible labor, it's things like managing the schedules, the appointments, the paperwork, the communication, the relationships, and also anticipating. So knowing what's coming up, not just what's on the calendar, but also what's going to need to be done soon. And I've heard it described, registering for a good camp can be like trying to get concert tickets. I've heard of other parents who they know the day that the registration opens for a well-priced, fun camp, and they are on their computer like super like competitively trying to get a spot in this camp for their kids. And there's also just things like normal household routines, supplies, organizing and storing, maintaining things, handling the finances. The book also, or the article also talks about things like bigger purchases, like cars that happen where it's, it's not very often, hopefully, but it's pretty intensive when it happens. And they really described this increasing intensity of parenting, which is creating a bigger gap between sort of middle and upper class, and especially working class and upper class. So how much time is spent parenting? So women are actually doing more parenting than they used to. And there's a lot of, again, I'm very much in the thick of parenting right now. There's a lot of jokes about like how moms did things in the 80s, which is when many of us who are moms right now grew up, versus how moms do things now. And just the intensity and the level of supervision has gone up quite a bit. And so men have doubled, more than doubled, but women have also almost doubled, and we started a good bit higher. So we're still over, a little over twice as high as men. And this is upper class. They also gave some numbers for middle class or working class, where there's less time, just because there's fewer hours in the day, to be honest. If you're working longer shifts, if you can't afford to get a cleaner or to get takeout, or to get your groceries delivered, if you're having to run all of these errands yourself, if you're having to do it on a bus or by foot, you just have fewer hours in the day to parent. There's also, I forget if I brought this up or if they did, but there's different perceived judgment when moms do things versus dads. So, and it can kind of go different ways. I know, so often it's discussed that like dads get passes, like, oh, you tried. And I think that often does happen. But that is also very patronizing. So sometimes my husband will actually be a little more focused on things like accidentally putting my kids' pants on backwards, which doesn't really matter. But if I'll say, oh, we put it on backward, but it's not a big deal, let's just get him to school. My husband might be more likely to say like, no, I'm dropping him off. They're going to think I did it and think that I'm a doof. We're going to put them on the right way. So I think in some ways it can kind of go both ways, but I also know there are definitely times where he just takes the win. Like if he takes our son to the grocery store a lot more than I do. And part of it is if our son's being a little whatever, people give my husband more leeway than they typically give me, or they're more willing to help out. Not that everybody's always a jerk, but to me, but just in general, there's a lot more forgiveness of like, and a lot of admiration. Oh, you're parenting in public, which again is kind of demeaning, but he takes the wins sometimes. It seemed like a big piece of this emotional labor was feeling responsible for everyone else's happiness. And as a psychologist, I'm like, yeah, that would be stressful because you can't make everybody happy. So specifically concerns about children's emotional development and moral development, well-being. And this was really linked with partner satisfaction, life satisfaction, feelings of emptiness. And so that it could be that, these fears of kind of long-term consequences, that if my kid's not happy, then terrible things are going to happen. And they also discussed this sort of how when there is this unequal responsibility, it can really damage the partner relationship. And I certainly have, in my circle, again, it's going to be a very biased circle because it's mine. We all have biased circles, but in just my personal circle, the people I've seen who end their marriage are typically people in the most unequal partnerships. Friendships gets mentioned but not really discussed, and I think that's a real issue, that we don't think about the importance of friendships for women and other relationships. There's a lot of pressure on this partnership, but it's also tough because we're talking about a household, we're talking about children, and that is typically something that you're sharing with your partner. This really leads into a real world example where someone was looking for help, and even in a mom's group, I saw people, like a group for working moms, somebody commented, well, why did this person even have children if she just wanted someone else to raise them? And we were like, what? Like, that's not what we're here for. And in that same group, there were people who were saying, complaining like, oh, it's my busy season at work. Like, I feel really bad because I'm leaving my kid in daycare for like 8-hour days. And at first I was like, yeah, I identify with that. And then I was like, wait, 8 hours is really, like, that's not that long, because it's not just your work day. That's also time to get to and from work from daycare. And this is what they're saying, like, oh, I feel awful during the busy days. And there were a lot of people who were like, to function, to keep, a roof over my kid's head, I have them in daycare 10 hours a day. So there's often a lot of judgment among even working moms. It's really tough. Part of what really interested me about this job listing, it was written by a CEO, and so it's kind of seeing household management listed out as individual tasks. So it's really getting, in my mind, it really gets at this captaining idea. And she even directly references the I Want a Wife reading that we did at the beginning. It's a classic. I was interested by why this person thought it was really important to emphasize how much she loves her child's caregivers and her staff, and how she's a very loving person. It's really tough for me to imagine a man feeling like that was relevant or needed to be said. And there's also I've seen critiques of her saying that she needs this because she needs to relax on the weekends. And really what I hear from it, it's not like, oh, I don't want to spend time with my children on the weekends. What I actually hear is, I want to spend time with my children on the weekends. If you remember, hopefully you had grandparents that you could spend time with when you were a small child. My son has grandparents who are very close, and he loves going to their house. And it's really, really fun because when he goes to their house, they're playing with him. They're spending time with him. They have either done their housework or can wait to do their housework for the most part. And I notice for me when I'm staying home, when I'm not trying to get work done or housework done, most of the time I have a pretty fun day with him. The difficulty of raising children is also getting anything on God's green earth done while caring for the child. And so I really interpret it as, I just want to be with my kids. I don't want to be planning a million different things. I don't want to be dealing with all of these details. I don't want to be telling other people what to do. I just want to be able to be home and with my kids. And so I think that's interesting. It really emphasizes how much multitasking makes caregiving difficult. A talk on paid maternity leave. They talk about the physical toll of childbirth. They talk about breastfeeding, and I always push back a little bit. There's assumptions of breastfeeding as normal, and honestly, in my opinion, the best research on breastfeeding is kind of ambiguous, how much of a benefit it really gives. When you compare this, because often people who breastfeed have more advantages than people who don't. So when you compare kids in the same family where some were breastfed and some were given formula, the differences pretty much disappear. For example, I pumped breast milk for my kid for a while. He never latched. So I don't know, depending on your definition, I might be counted or might not be, but I definitely stopped when he was around 6 or 7 months old. But if you just look at my data and you see anything associated with him, you might assume it's driven by the fact that he never latched well. But here's the thing. He was born 2 months early. That's a big part of why he never latched well, because in the NICU, he needed to be given a bottle. And when he left the NICU, we just wanted to get out of the NICU. He really didn't have the strength yet to nurse, and he was just lazy because he was used to the bottle. So I tried really hard, and it just didn't work out. And there's lots of reasons like that breastfeeding may not work out for people. And so the research, again, research that just looks at whether he was breastfed may not account for the health issues that contributed to why he wasn't breastfed, it just depends on your definition. So again, remembering that feminism really needs to work for all women, not just for a small group of women, because we know women who breastfeed are more likely to be well educated, to be, I think, white, but I'm not sure about that. But also to be higher income in general, because they're the people with the leave and who can go to lactation consultants and all sorts of reasons. So it's important to keep that in mind. And I think this comes to a big question of, are babies a societal responsibility or an individual responsibility? And that really defines how we make room for babies and families in society. And this is really heavy, that suicide is the second most common cause of death in a woman's first year postpartum. And that's another thing that's ignored quite a bit. When you give birth, they give you the Edinburgh postpartum depression checklist many, many times. I don't know that most people follow up on it, though. I've heard from women who say, I was very honest, I was very much struggling. I was very honest about that on the form. Nobody ever talked to me about it. And I'm also very skeptical because she talks about how kind of everywhere else in the world almost has figured out how to make maternity leave happen. And the U.S. doesn't. And it just feels like there's a lot of things that every country is different. But it just seems like there's a lot of things that lots of very different countries have figured out how to do that the U.S. just says, no, we can't possibly do that here. And so I'm very skeptical of that. And I've seen in other places like Japan, I've seen a lot of work around this, where when you have anti-family policies, your birth rate falls, which is fine for a little bit and then becomes a really big issue because you don't have enough incoming people to keep the economy going to care for everyone else. And we're seeing that in the U.S. I also will add on personally, I mentioned this already, when you have babies with medical complications or complicated pregnancies, so some women go on bed rest for months before they give birth. With my child, he was born, but 51 days just got us out of the hospital with a newborn. And even then, he was he was still a week or two before his due date, so he was a very young newborn. So we still needed my body got to heal during that time, which was actually very nice that by the time I brought my son home, I was capable of doing most housework and things without, a lot of women make it happen, but I was actually ready to do those things. But there's still just the needs of a newborn to consider. Data on parenting. So Emily Oster, she's where I get the information about breastfeeding, with the kind of the studies of how beneficial it is. And maybe we'll find out over time that it is much more beneficial. But so far we haven't been able to document it very clearly. There's some findings that are positive, but there's a lot of more mixed findings too. So she's written a couple books. This is an interview with her. She talks about kind of myths of motherhood. And she talks specifically some about breastfeeding. I'm trying to think what here might be. So one issue, and I forget how much of this I took from the interview and how much of this is me kind of pulling knowledge from having read her book and read other things she's written. But there's a lot of issues with understanding research. There's a lot of social pressure for breastfeeding. There's a lot of very strong advocates of breastfeeding. And I love this saying, they might not always be right, but they're never in doubt. So there's a lot of very loud, very strong, very authoritative sounding voices saying breastfeeding is really important. And they will say, because science has proven that it is. I never like the word proof with science. But research is really hard. I went to school for a very, very long time to understand nuances of research. I have more research training than most medical doctors. So it's this push-pull of I want to trust my doctors, but also with a PhD, I genuinely understand more about research and nuance than they do typically. There's a lot of, not all data is equal. There's good quality data and bad quality data. And especially when you have these multifactorial problems, when you have so many things that affect the outcomes, physicians really aren't trained in that sort of research typically. They know how to read the journals and read the articles, but some of the nuances they might not be trained in understanding. There's also a lot of issues with who's able to breastfeed. So if you have an hourly job at minimum wage and you have to go back 2 weeks after your baby's born, pumping takes a long time. It's really hard. It's kind of expensive. You need a lot of equipment to make it happen. People who say it saves money, if you have to pump, it does not. Especially, it only saves money if you don't value your time at all. Because you have to pump and then you still have to give the bottle to the baby. Whereas breastfeeding, at least like it's all one shot, but it also takes forever from my understanding. So who's able to breastfeed is a big piece. And they also, one of the advocacies around breastfeeding is it makes it so easy to go around with the baby. Or that, again, I'm very sensitive to this. But people will say, it's really easy to go out when your baby's really small. But my kid spit up all the time, which is common with NICU babies. And as I said, I pumped. And so we had to carry his milk with us. We had to follow a lot of safety rules. We had to have clean bottles and everything to do it. And also, if I was out for more than a few hours at a time, I had to figure out where and how to pump and have all my materials. So it created a huge burden for us, and it worked while we were both home for the summer. But when I went back to work, even though I had a private office, I had a fridge, I had all the things to make it as easy as possible, it was still really, really hard. So I think it's important to understand when we think about motherhood, it's important to understand all of the burdens. All right. Friendship. I think it's important to think about women's roles outside the family, and we're getting that with career, but there's not much, I really couldn't find much academically about friendships among women. So if you want to do research, that's a great place to consider. The Bechdel test, it's something with movies where it's the test, do two women characters have a conversation with each other that does not involve discussing a man? Kind of as a test for whether women are really developed and meaningful characters in a movie. And so it's kind of like a Bechdel test for the research literature, that do we talk about anything about women that doesn't involve men or babies? I think the acknowledgement of female friendship is on the rise. Particularly, I think of things like Parks and Rec and Galentine's Day, how this started as sort of a bit that Leslie Knope loved her friends so much that she wanted to celebrate them with Galentine's Day, the day before Valentine's Day. And now it's like an actual marketed commercial thing. Like, I don't think it's on calendars yet, but you can buy Galentine's Day cards, and it's advertised as like, do things for Galentine's Day. This last article, this one is focusing on work. I probably could have put it under our violence and trauma chapter, so that's awesome to know. Zoe and the Trolls, it's about something called Gamergate. It's this situation that happened particularly in video gaming. I want to start, so in this article, I think they ask Zoe what pronouns are preferred, and Zoe says, like, she, her, or they, them, it doesn't really matter, something like that. And the article uses she, her. But the person who told me about this article had interviewed her for a piece for something before, because he has worked as a journalist in the video game industry, and said, like, oh, this is a good article, but they mess up the pronouns. And so I did a little more digging, and this is more recent than the article, it's from summer 2019, Zoe identified they, them as the preferred pronouns. So I am going to do my best to use they, them. And I ask that, though, especially in writing, you can go back and check. So particularly in writing, I'm going to have a higher standard that you do it. If you're speaking and you slip up, that's something to work on, but that's difficult. So it's a very detailed article. It talks a lot about Zoe's experience, how they were treated. And I think, again, a lot of these themes will come back when we talk about violence in the 5th module. And so it's important to think about what hobbies, careers, and other spaces are kind of male owned. Men feel a lot of ownership of video gaming. And there's an interesting history of how that became a gendered hobby. My hobby is tabletop board gaming, as I showed in the last lecture. And there are still definitely a lot of spots, especially wargaming and certain corners of that. But in general, there is often still a sense of these spaces being male owned. When you look at the biggest kind of media figures who review games and things, it's mostly men, especially at the top. Game designers are heavily overrepresented by men. And also, probably not coincidentally, there's a lot of overrepresentation of white individuals at the top of the field. And so thinking about how women get pushed out of these spaces, how women get kept out of these spaces, there's a lot of talk about inappropriate gatekeeping. So saying, no, you can't be part of this hobby. But there's also very direct, especially women who want to push the status quo, who want to ask for more space and more representation. There can be very direct, violent, sexual themes in the harassment of these women. So by that I mean rape threats, death threats, slut shaming, and that's very clear in the discussion of Zoe and what happened. This last one I picked up, I was listening to a podcast Factually with Adam Connor. He does the Adam Ruins Everything show. I linked to the podcast where I originally heard about this from. There's no transcript, unfortunately, but I found a YouTube video of the talk that she's discussing. She talks about the influence. She's talking about Me Too and how men's reactions to that movement may be unrealistic and also can harm women. Hey, sweetie, can you turn on the light for me? Thank you. Can you turn on the one in front of me?
Did I get it?
Nope, you got the fan. Thank you. That's very different light, but that's better. I'm not as fuzzy now. So she talks about, first, it's important to understand, particularly in academia, but I think in a lot of fields, mentors really can direct your future. In academia and graduate school in particular, funding, lab and research resources, that's very much influenced by your mentors, your advisors. Also things like evaluations, being able to move forward with your dissertation, being connected with other people, getting letters of recommendation. These are all very important things for launching a career. So it's very important to have good relationships with your mentors. It's part of why it's hard to complain if your mentor isn't treating you fairly, because you are so vulnerable and so dependent on your mentor. And she talks about hearing men say, that's why I don't mentor women, because I don't want to accidentally harass them. I forget if she talks about, I don't think she talks about this in the video up here. I think it's in the podcast. She will reflect back to them, okay, choose any other underprivileged group, race, class, age, and say that back again. Like, that's why I don't mentor non-white people. And think about how that would sound. And would it fly with any other group? And she says when they do that, they often kind of realize how discriminatory that comes out. She talks about the false impressions of what is causing the problems, that there's often impressions that these are just small mistakes or things that anyone can do, but that often there is an unbroadcast, very egregious wrongdoing. And one question is, how common is this issue? And she describes herself as being in STEM, in the podcast at least. And I was kind of like, oh yeah, I've heard people talk about STEM and how many of these issues there are there. And I'm really glad I'm not in STEM. I'm glad it's not like that in psychology. And then it turns out she's in psychology. So then I started to think a little more deeply, and I realized every time this has come up with other people with PhDs, everybody has a story. It may not have been something that happened during their time in their program, but it's something that's big enough and impactful enough to still be part of the program's memory when they get there, that they were told the story. And this happened in my program. In my program, the person who the professor had a romantic relationship with was actually okay with it. And there's some indications that they later, after the person graduated, they continued the relationship. But it was a very, very uncomfortable situation for many other students, especially because ethics around boundaries are so important within counseling psych, which is what the program was. And there ended up eventually being some repercussions for what happened. But it kind of had to take a backdoor route because, again, the person who was involved wasn't unhappy. And we could discuss whether then it's a problem, but it is kind of an issue because there is this evaluatory role. There's just a lot of complicated pieces to it. But either way, it is, at least in academia, this issue is very common. I don't know if how many other fields have such an extreme reliance on a mentor during this middle part of your career, but I certainly think it can happen a good bit. All right, what did I leave out? Career development. There's a lot that's just been left out, but also there's really interesting like wife of headlines. And there's an example about where they described Senora Diego Rivera, so Frida Kahlo, as wife of the master mural painter gleefully dabbles in works of art. And it's an article, it's a photo of the article, so you can't read the text as clearly as ideal. But this is something you still see today, though, where there'll be headlines for things that really emphasize the man, even if the woman is more sort of objectively important. It'll still be, man and this woman. Lifespan development, we didn't talk that much about the overall lifespan, especially older age. We just kind of touched on it briefly. Marriage and relationship satisfaction, we talked a little bit, but again, we still left out a lot of relationship types, and we didn't talk much about divorce. We didn't talk much about parenting, single parenting, co-parenting with a former partner, which are very different experiences. It's very different to be co-parenting but not partnered versus actually being like the only parent. We also didn't mention much about LGBTQIA issues this week, so how does that extra level of stigma affect progress, or can it give privilege in some settings? How does it add extra visibility and extra scrutiny around parenting issues? And I think there are probably a lot of other underrepresented groups that we didn't get into very much this time. We didn't talk a whole lot about racial diversity or other intersectional issues that affect the experiences of women. Obviously, these modules cover really big topics, so I try to get some representation of different issues, but there is a lot that's being left out. Remember that you can always use that as part of what you choose for your media report, and you can also shine lights on things through your topical posts too. My hope is that we each are bringing part of our lived experience along with what we're finding in the sources for this class. Let me just double check. Yep, that's all good. Thanks. Bye.